I was 26 days into my first deployment when Commander Reyes finally told me the truth about the coyote, and by then there was no use minding it. She wasn't broken. She was built to look broken. Half her sensor masts were dead on purpose, replaced with housings that read empty on a long-range scan. Her drive trailed a thin smear of false coolant, vented on a schedule, so that anyone watching from a distance would see a crippled little scout dragging herself home and dying slow. We drifted at the edge of Corvette space for 3 weeks, doing nothing but bleeding that lie into the dark, waiting for someone to notice. Someone did. Those 3 weeks taught me more about patience than 4 years at the academy ever had. We ran the ship cold. Minimal heat, minimal chatter, lights down to a third, so the hull's thermal bloom would read consistent with a dying reactor. Reyes made us eat in shifts of 2, never more, because a mess hall full of healthy laughter doesn't match a derelict sensor signature. I spent most nights listening to the coyote's false coolant ticking through lines that didn't need it, wondering whether the part of the job nobody warned me about was simply how much of war turns out to be waiting in the dark, pretending to be smaller than you are. I had the sensor watch when the contact came up, a single hull moving fast and quiet on an intercept vector, the kind of approach a predator makes when it has already decided the kill is easy. Reyes didn't flinch. She told me to stand down the weapons we didn't actually have working and to let them come aboard if they tried. They tried. Their boarding party cut through the outer hatch with a tool shaped like a claw, and the first one through war plating the color of dried rust, ridged along the spine, eyes set wide and low like something built to watch the ground for movement rather than the horizon. He spoke through a translator box bolted crudely to his collar, and the voice that came out was flat, almost bored, the voice of a man doing paperwork. Gotta go. Crew. Yield it. I learned his name later. Tesk, a blade-cast lieutenant out of a patrol garrison nobody important watched too closely. But in that moment, he was only weight and ridges and the calm certainty of someone who believed the universe had already finished surprising him. His people, I came to understand, lived inside a ladder. Marrow cast dug and built and died young. Blade cast fought and policed and clawed for rank. Spire cast ruled from orbit, untouchable, and judged every blade officer by what he dragged home to lay at their feet. Tess needed a prize. We were drifting hurt alone. We looked exactly like one. I gave him nothing. Reyes gave him nothing. We let them strip the bridge consoles, catalog the crew, run their scanners over hull plating that told them everything they wanted to hear, and none of it true. I stood with my hands bound in a polymer cuff that bit at the wrist and watched Tesk's crew float through corridors built to look gutted, wiring pulled loose on purpose, bulkheads scorched with paint instead of fire, a galley left half-eaten to suggest a crew that had given up planning for tomorrow. One of his men ran a glove claw along a console housing and made a low clicking sound that I would later learn was something like satisfaction. They believed every inch of it. I understood, in a way the Academy had never managed to teach me, that the whole performance only worked because we were willing to be afraid for real in case it stopped being a performance. It stopped 20 minutes later. By then my arm had gone numb below the cuff, and I'd stopped trying to read anything useful in Tesk's face. Fear, in my limited experience of him, looked exactly like boredom. The same flat patience a man wears when he already knows how a transaction will end and is only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I remember thinking that if this was the last conversation I ever had, it would be a remarkably uninteresting one, and being almost grateful for that, because terror is easier to sit with when it doesn't bother to perform itself. The coyote carried one true system, buried under every false one, and it didn't need a hand to fire it. It needed only enough elapsed time inside Corvette territory, undisturbed recording, patrol patterns, the chatter on Test's command channel, the shape of how his people moved when they believed no one capable of understanding was listening. 3 weeks of silence had been the price. The boarding was the proof of payment. The system read what it needed and sent one signal, and somewhere beyond the asteroid belt, the rest of the answer began to move. I felt it before I saw it, a shudder through the Coyote's hull that had nothing to do with her engines, because she had none running. Tesk felt it too. His head came up. His men stopped cataloging crates, and for the first time the boredom went out of his voice when he barked an order into the collar box. Outside the cracked viewport, the dark folded back. The Halberd came first because she was built to come first. A dreadnought the length of 3 of Test's garrison ships laid end to end. Her hull scored black with old fire she'd never bothered to repaint over. Gun decks lit amber down both flanks like a row of waiting mouths. Behind her, in close formation, for escorts unspooled out of the same dark, holding position with the kind of patience that doesn't need to announce itself. Debris from some old, unrelated battle drifted past her bow, caught for a moment in the amber light, and even that looked deliberate, like she'd simply absorbed it into her wake on the way in. None of them fired. None of them needed to. Test's translator box caught our broadcast a half-second after his own sensors did, and the voice that came through it wasn't mine or Reyes's. It was a recording, flat and unhurried, built from 3 weeks of listening to exactly how his people preferred to be addressed. We came to talk. You chose to take. We are still willing to talk. I have turned that line over more times than I can count in the years since. Because of everything that happened in that boarding bay, that was the only moment I saw real fear on Tesk. Not fear of the guns, though there were enough of those to erase his garrison from the record twice over. Fear of being wrong about the shape of the world. He had read us as marrow, weak, expendable, meant to be taken. The Halberd told him, without raising her voice, that he'd misjudged the entire ladder he'd spent his life climbing. His hands shook when he gave the order to stand down. Not because Reyes had a weapon on him, because somewhere above his garrison, on a channel he couldn't silence fast enough, a Spirecast voice he actually answered to had already heard the broadcast too, and was already asking him, in the tone Marrowcast workers learned to fear from birth, why he'd put his claws on something his superiors hadn't been told was even out here. They withdrew within the hour. No shots fired, not because anyone showed mercy, but because the math of the situation had finished resolving itself in front of every officer watching. 3 days later, a Spire delegate, careful, formal, plainly furious at having been outmaneuvered by their own blade cast, opened a channel to the Halberd directly, and the talking Tesk had refused to do at gunpoint began in earnest, on terms nobody got to dictate alone. It took the better part of a year to call a treaty, and even then it was a cold thing, more a set of boundaries both sides agreed not to test again than anything either government would call friendship. I read the early transcripts once, long after, and what struck me wasn't the diplomacy. It was how often the Corvette negotiators used the word recalibrate, as if humanity were a measurement they had taken wrong the first time and were now correcting on a record, cast by cast, with no appetite for repeating the mistake. I think about the cuff mark on my wrist sometimes, faded now, and what it cost to wear it without flinching long enough for the lie to finish its work. Reyes told me once that the hardest part of the job isn't the danger. It's holding still while someone decides what kind of thing you are, knowing the moment will come when they find out they were wrong, and trusting that when it does, your own side will still be the one that chose not to fire first. We never found out what would have happened if Tesk had killed us before the Halberd cleared the belt. Reyes says that's the whole point. You build the bait good enough that the question never gets asked. I believe her, but I still remember the exact second the dark folded back outside that viewport, and the shudder that came up through a dead hull a half-breath before the only sound that mattered. Silence, held steady by something large enough to never need to raise its voice at all.